In this presentation, we're going to add and expense transactions as we go through our bank feeds. In other words, we've entered the bank feed information. We're going to have transactions, one of them being an expense-related transaction. We'll think about how to use those bank feeds in order to help us to create that expense transaction that will then be populated or help us to populate and create the financial statements. Here we go with Xero. Here we are in our Triple G dashboard. We're going to start off by opening up our financial statements. We haven't added anything to the financial statements yet, but we want to think about what's going to be the effect on the financial statements as we do so, as we enter this information into the bank feeds. So we're going to go to the accounting dropdown. We're going to go down to the balance sheet. So the balance sheet is going to be one of our two major reports. Once that opens up, we're going to duplicate the tab, and we're going to duplicate the tab by going up top onto the tab, right-clicking on that tab, and then we'll duplicate it. And what'll happen is we'll put our reports to the right, and then we'll do our bank feed transactions on the left, and we'll be able to jump back and forth and kind of see what is happening to the financial statements as we do stuff to the bank feeds. So now we're going to go back to the left. We'll do this again to the other major report, that being the income statement, going down to the accounting drop-down. The income statement's going to be in the favorite reports as well, so we're going to pick up the income statement. When that opens up, we're going to duplicate the tab as we did with the balance sheet by going onto the tab up top. We're going to right click on that tab and duplicate that tab. So we have our two major reports or financial statements, the balance sheet. If I go into the balance sheet now, I'm going to adjust the date. We will be working in 2020. So I'm going to select the date drop down. We're going to bring this on up to February 29th. So there we go. We're going to update that. And again, nothing's there, even though we entered the bank feeds, because we entered the bank feeds, and I call them like I would think of them like in limbo right now. They're in limbo, they're in the system, but they're not in the financial statements. And the same is going to be true for, of course, the income statements. Nothing is there as of yet. Now let's go back to the first tab, where we will take a look at the bank feed transactions. So if we go back to the dashboards, remember, there's a couple different ways you can get into the bank feeds. So you might be dealing with people that like to go into the bank feeds by going down on from the dashboard to the checking account down here, or you could go up top and go to the accounting drop down and go to the bank accounts, and that'll list out the bank account. So then if we go into and remember this bank account, just to let you know, if you have credit cards as well, they're also going to be here in the bank accounts, even though those are like liabilities, which could seem a little weird at first, but that's because there's bank feeds to them, so they're really like financial institution type of accounts where we can get bank feed type of accounts. So in any case, we want to be in here, and we've got the 13 transactions that we want to, or items that we want to record. So I'm going to select those items, and then we were left off here last time where we have basically the bank information on the left, and then the book information on the right. Now I'm going to hold down Control and scroll up a little bit so that we'll zoom in a little bit at the 125. I'm at the 125. Now we're on the Reconcile tab. There's three tabs. There's the bank information, there's the account transactions. We're on the first tab, this Reconciling tab. We have information on the left directly from the bank, nothing on the right because that's the book information and we haven't entered the books. So we're doing this whole thing from the bank on basically a cash basis type of system, and we'll talk about, deviating from that at a later time. So if I look through these transactions, then I'm going to say, okay, how can I add these to our system? I want to start off with an expense that's a fairly straightforward expense that we would expect to see often, something like an Edison. That's going to be our utility bill. So let's go down to this bottom one and start with this one. What would we do with regards to Edison? We know it's going to be a utility bill. Now we have to enter it into the system. So there's a couple ways that we could do this. So we could go over here, and this is kind of like a quick data input screen. It's going to be a quick form that allows us to input as we go. So that's one thing we can do. We can go in and we can actually look at the form that would be used to enter a normal data input, meaning it would be some kind of a check or cash going out, a payment type form, and then it would match up over here. And or most likely for most of these that we know are gonna repeat, we can also make basically a rule. I can say, hey, every time I see that, so that next month when Edison comes up, I want you to basically create this transaction automatically. So let's look at a couple of these methods. First, let's think about making the Edison bill as if we were going to make it with an actual form, so you can see what form would typically be used. So let's do that first. I'm going to do this a couple different ways. We're going to go up top. We're going to right click on this tab again, duplicate the tab again. So now we have our balance sheet, our income statement, and then our bank feeds on the left. And then we're going to be working on this tab. Now, normally, if you were going to enter in the book side of things, cash going out of the checking account, it would be something like this. We would go up top here. I'm going to select the plus button, and then I'm going to go down and we're going to say that this is going to be spend money. So we're going to use like a spend money type of data input form. So this is the normal form that you would have for basically, money going out, spending money. It would be coming out of the checking account. So it's going to go out of the checking account. Note there's nothing in the checking account at this time, at least with regards to Xero. There's money in the checking account for our financial statement, but we haven't entered the beginning balance as well, and we'll have to deal with that at a later time as well. So now we're just going to deal with the activity. So we're going to say I'm going to say Edison, and I'm going to say that this is on... I'm just going to use the same date. Now, note if it was a check, it would be some date before this. If we're relying on the bank, then, like, normally I would enter the transaction when it actually happened, if I wrote a check. And that would be sometime before it cleared the bank, which is March 31st. But if we're completely dependent on the bank, then I'll just use the bank date. It's not, it doesn't happen until it cleared the bank because that's what we're using. So I'm going to say here that it's March 31st. So we'll say that, and we're going to say the quantity, I'm going to say 1, and the price would be for the 620. So I'm going to say 620. The account that would be affected would be some kind of utilities. So I'm going to see if they have one here, an expense account for utilities, insurance, I don't see one. So I'm going to put it into, I'm going to make it for the account number, let's make it 6335 is the number. 6335, 633. I'm going to make another account. That's what, in case you didn't see that up top, I'm making another account. So I'm hitting here. I'm going to make another account as we go because there wasn't one set up for us. And it's going to be the code number 6335. I'm putting it kind of in where all the other expenses are by doing that. And then the account type, I'm going to say is an expense type of account. So it's going to be just an expense type of account. I'm under the expenses, an expense type of account. And then I'm going to call it utilities. Did I spell that right? Yes. Okay, utilities. All right, and it's an expense type. Key here, expense type of account. Then we're going to say save, and that would be our normal type of transaction, right? This would be us recording it on the book side of things. And if it was a check, we can write, check off that it's a check number here. If it's an electronic transfer, we could use the same form without checking off the check number. Now let's go ahead and save this. So if we record this, now we have now recorded it on the book side of things. So there it is. If I go then back to the bank reconciliation, I'm going to refresh the screen by selecting this little item up top, or you can click on like the entire URL and just click enter on your keyboard. Then I'll refresh the screen, and if I go then back down, it should find that one. So now it's saying, hey, here's the book side, here's the bank side of things, here's the book side of things, they match. Now it's on the first tab, it's saying, hey, it matches at this point. Is that the right, so it's asking us at this time, is that the right one? And if it is, we'll just say okay, and that'll reconcile it. So in other words, if I go back up top here, you'll note we're on the reconciling tab, on the bank statement tab. This is all our bank information that basically we put in there from the bank feed. We did put in there from the bank feed. It's not really basically. Yeah, that's what happened. And then here's on the book side of things. If I go to the account transactions, this is what we have entered on the book side of things, which is just that 620, which we made based on the reconciliation data. So that's one way you can do that. And the reason I wanted to kind of show that is because that's the actual form. This is the actual form you would use. If I go to the second tab here, that you would be using this cash out type of form, and that would be the normal form that would drive the transaction. If I went to the balance sheet then, and if I was to update the balance sheet, and I'm going to go ahead and update here with the little update button now, and I'm going to bring this out to, not to February, to March. We want to bring that, now update it. Now something should happen. And then I go back down, there's the 620. So we have the 620 on the liability. Notice the checking account is under liabilities and not assets because it's overdrawn. We'll have to deal with the beginning balance as well. So we'll deal with that in a later presentation. I'm just going to do the transactions, the activity, which will result in a negative amount right now. The other side went to equity. So there's the other side. If I was then to go into that 620, notice the source form, which is like the form that we input, is called a spend money form. So that's the form that we used. That's usually the form for a money going out type of transaction. If I go then in to that 620, again, we're going to actually go to that form, which is a spend money form. This is what we entered the transaction as. That's normally that's the normal form that you would enter the transaction as. So now I'm going to go back up. Now the other side, of course, goes, well, let's go back out to the balance sheet, back to the balance sheet, and back to the balance sheet. I'm going back again to get to the balance sheet. Now the other side of the transaction will typically be on the income statement. We entered an expense, so the other side is going to be on the income statement. If I go here, update the income statement, then we're going to say, okay, there's the 620 expense. We don't have any income yet, and there we have the loss. So that's the effect on the financial statements. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to delete that transaction and see how we can enter it in a different way. So I'm going to go back to the balance sheet. Let's drill back down into it, and then I'm going to basically remove it. So I'm going to go back into the chase, this 620. I'm going to go back into there. And then I'm going to go back into the transaction by just selecting that transaction. Okay, here is the transaction. I'm going to edit this transaction now. Or actually, I'm just going to go to the options up top and remove. I'm going to remove and redo. So I'm going to remove the transaction up here. And so we'll remove it. And there it is. Now let's go back to the balance sheet. I'm going to go back here and back till we get to the balance sheet. And if this going back is confusing you, then just open up the balance sheet again. And then you could get back to it. Then I'm going to update the balance sheet report, and now there's nothing in it again. Nothing's in the balance sheet. If I go to the income statement and update the income statement, it should remove the transaction. Now we're back to nothing in it. So let's go back to the bank reconciliation. I'm going to refresh this screen as well. Down here, before I refresh it, we have this item. We could match it out. I mean, we could have matched it out, but now I deleted that transaction. So we're going to go back up top, and I'm going to remove this. I'm going to refresh the screen, and that should remove that transaction. Now, the other way that we can enter this transaction is we can use the same kind of process, enter a spend money type of form, but we can do it in like a quick method. We can do it just with the items over here. So you'll note we have 3 tabs: match, the one we saw before when the system's trying to match up a transaction that's already been input into the system, or we got the create, and then we have the discuss. The discuss is a nice tab if you have multiple people that use the accounting software and you don't know, how to match something out. You could say, hey, here's a note. I need to ask somebody else, that's using the system, and you could put that here, and someone else that goes into the system that knows about that particular part of the system may be able to answer that note, and you can kind of work with multiple people with that. I'm going to go back to the create tab. So then we can use this as kind of a quick create. So we're going to basically make a spend money form in a shortened way, just write in, the reconciliation system. So we could put the who and the what, which is the account right here, which would be utilities, and a description right in here, or we can add more details. Let's take a look at what the add details would look like. If we go into the add details option down here, again, we're on the right-hand side, entering basically the book information in. And we have a similar field as we would for the pay field, which is going to be, I'm going to put Edison. And you can oftentimes just copy and paste, Edison up top. You can copy it down here and put it down into the vendor. Oftentimes, this item up here will, of course, be the vendor oftentimes. And it's going to be as of the 31st. Remember, that's not when we actually wrote the check. That's simply when it cleared the bank. We probably wrote it or we created it sometime before that. If it was a check, it could have been a while before that because it takes time to clear and enter and clear. If it was an electronic transfer, it's probably pretty close, within like 3 days. And so we're not going to have an item. That item typically deals with like inventory items. So if we don't have inventory, we're not going to typically be doing the item tab. Usually we have to put a 1 here because it always calculates the same way. And that's a way for Xero to use kind of the same data input form for multiple kind of transactions. So it's kind of standardized. And then we have the 620. The account we set up was utilities. Now remember, when you set up, you might have to set up accounts over here as you go when you do this type of process. Xero will give you a lot of the accounts. So you want to check and see if they're in Xero. If they're in Xero, then use that account. And then if you want to kind of use these account numbers, or the code numbers to the right, So in other words, like we did when we entered this, we looked up, what's the appropriate code, or I want this somewhere in the expenses. The expenses have 6 something next to it. So I want to find something in the 6 something area and line up the number here. If you don't use an account number or a code number, it's not, the end of the world, but it's going to be easier to use certain functions if you use those code numbers, and you want to be the way you do that is you basically kind of be within the number scheme, the number arrangement that is here. So we're going to be putting utilities, and there's no tax rate, so that's going to be it. So there's the 620, and so again, we just basically entered the payment. What does this do? Just like it did with the other input, the bill, it's going to decrease the checking account. We don't have anything in it, so it's going to go negative. It's going to create a liability, and the other side is going to go to the expense account, which will be utilities, and the vendor then, if we ran a report by vendor, would be Edison. So let's save that transaction. And you'll see by doing that, we basically entered the book side of things already. So we entered a transaction, same kind of transaction, in the system just from a different data input screen. So if I go back to the balance sheet, for example, and then I was to update the balance sheet, then we're back at that 620s back, right? So we've entered our side. It's a liability because we're overdrawn because we don't have the beginning balance. We'll talk about that later. So we're going to have a liability here. We're going to go to the income statement. And if I was to update the income statement, then once again, we're back at that 620. We've increased the 620. If we go back to the first tab and we were to select the banking or account transaction information, this would be on our side. We have entered this information on our side. It's unreconciled at this point in time until we match it out using the reconcile process over here. So then if we go back to the first tab, we're going to go back to the reconcile tab, and going back down, again, we have the option now of reconciling. Okay, so let's do the third way to do this just one more time. I'm going to actually delete this again. So I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to delete this transaction. I'm going to go into it. I'm going to drill down into it and say, let's see if we could do this one different way. And this next way is probably the most common way when you have repeated transactions. And that's going to be, hey, save the transaction so you do the same thing next time, right? So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to say, remove this transaction, please. And so now it's gone again. I'm going to go back into the balance sheet this time by hitting the accounting dropdown, balance sheet. And then we'll just go right back into it and we will update the date, bringing it back up to March. So I'm going to bring this back up to March, March 31st, and update. So once again, nothing's there. Nothing's on the income statement. If I update it, I'm going to update the income statement. Once again, we have no data there. And if I go back to the balance sheet and refresh with this little button right here, or you can just highlight the whole URL and re-enter it. And then we're going to go back down. Okay, let's do this again. Right, we're going to do it again. And we're going to say, all right, now there's nothing over here again. Well, what do you normally do if Edison's going to pop up all the time? Like I want to see it next month. Then what I want to do is I'm going to go, all right, let's go to the options down below, and I want to create a bank rule for it. And this is going to be the thing you'll do whenever you can. Whenever you could set up a bank rule that's going to help you as this goes through. So it's a spend money rule as opposed to a receive money rule or a transfer money rule, because obviously, we're spending money, the money's going out. When money spent on the bank statement matches all of the following conditions. Now you could say all conditions or some conditions. You might want to make it more broad. You might say any condition instead of all conditions. Because what it's doing is it's picking all of the condition and it's defaulting to the most stringent type of rule. But you may not want the most stringent type of rule. You may say, hey, every time it goes to Edison, every time you see Edison, I don't care if it has Edison and something else or Edison 1, 2, 3 after it. If it says Edison, it should be going to the utility, right? That's basically the rule that we want to put here. And that's a broader rule than would be the default, because the default here is picking up all the information that it has from the bank feed typically. So this payee field, the payee field is blank, and I'm going to say that's okay. I'm just going to remove that rule altogether. I don't need a blank payee field. If it's blank or not blank, I'm removing that rule. The second one is the description. So if I select the description field, we want the description field either to equal or contain. Now again, I don't care if it's, if you get a bank feed, it might say like Edison, 254 or some kind of weirdness that transferred over on the description. If it says 254, I don't want it to not pick up the Edison. So what I want is a more broad category typically here. And we'll talk more about these when we talk about rules in general at a later time. But generally here, if you're just adding the rule, I'm just going to say I just need it to contain Edison. I don't need it to be like exact. If it says Edison anywhere in there, if it says Edison 254, I still want you to pick it up. So we're going to say Edison, and then set the contact. So contact will be an existing or new contact. So the payee from the bank, or entering during the reconciliation. Now I'm just always going to be picking up that it's going to be Edison. So I'm going to say I want the contact to be Edison, which is going to be an existing or new contact. So if you don't have Edison set up, it'll set up a new contact, which will be a vendor, basically, you can think of it. And if it's existing, it'll pick up that existing contact. So you don't want to duplicate your contacts. Go and double check to make sure that you spelled it right and everything, so you don't have like 2 Edisons in there. Automatically allocate fixed value line items. We don't have anything that we need here, so we'll typically leave that because we're going to have the whole thing go into one account. And then with the remainder, allocate items to the following on the following ratios. And we're not going to have we're just going to have 100% as our ratio. This is going to be utilities, and the account's going to be the utilities account that we have set up. No tax. And obviously, again, 100% is going to utilities. If we needed to break it out between multiple accounts on a percentage basis, you can see that you can do that here by adding another line and doing that. We may look at that when we get into more complex bank rules. Number 5, set the reference. I'm going to keep the default, which is by me during the bank rec. Number 6, target a bank account. Now, we have here our current bank account that we're on. You could select all bank accounts, which could be appropriate. If you see Edison, you want all bank accounts possibly. But we're going to add a checking account later, and we might want to look at that a little bit differently. So I'm going to just select this account for now. Again, you might just want to do all accounts, however, depending, again, it depends on the situation. But if you got the vendor lined up and you know that's going to be the same account that will be related to that vendor each time, you may want to do that. Give the rule a title, so we can call it, the Edison rule. That's going to be the name of the vendor. So typically you might want to name it by the vendor or some other type of rule, possibly utilities sub rule that you can go back in and see that rule in case you need to adjust it sometime in the future. So then we're going to go ahead and save that, and then I'll go back down and we'll see it here. Now it basically has the create, so it created this item with regards to our bank rule. Apply the Edison, that's the rule that it's applying. It's applying the rule of Edison because that's what we named it, you'll recall. And then we can say view the detail, and there's going to be the detail of it. Utilities 1, the 620, it created this now. So now we didn't make the form. We're telling it, hey, do this bank rule every time, and it's gonna create it for us. If that looks good, we're gonna go ahead and save the transaction. So I like that. We could basically go back in there and check the transaction and kind of save it in case something goes wrong, basically. So, and then we still have this reconciliation. So now we have the match happening. It's going to create it automatically for us for the rule, and then we can just basically check it off. Now this is probably the format you're going to have most of the time with the repeating type of expenses. So I'm going to say okay, and then we'll check that one off. Once again, if we go back up to the balance sheet and I update the balance sheet, then we're back to having that 620 back in there like we saw before. If I go to the income statement and update the income statement, then again, we're back to having that 620 there. It's creating our financial statements now as we do this. And then if I go back to our bank statement tab, this is our reconciliation. We did that one. We were at 13. Now we're at 12. The bank statement still has our bank statement information on it. However, this item is now reconciled. So this 620 we reconciled, meaning we matched the bank and our books. We created our books from the bank and then matched them. And then on the book side of things, we now have one transaction that we created from the bank feeds. We took the bank feed information, used that in order to generate one transaction. So we'll continue on with the 12 other items in future presentations. That's it for now. Let's get out of here.